And welcome to today's webinar on preserving scrapbooks. I'm Stephanie Lamson. On behalf of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and the Preservation Week Working Group, I'm happy to introduce this free webinar as part of ALA's Preservation Week. Many thanks to our sponsor for today's webinar, Gaylord. Our presenter today is Melissa Tedone. Melissa is the conservator at Iowa State University Library. She began her career in 1998 as a conservation technician and received an MSIS and Certificate of Advanced Study in Conservation of Library and Archival Materials from University of Texas at Austin in 2009. She has worked in the conservation labs of the Beinecke Library, the Lewis Walpole Library, and the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is currently a member of the American Institute for Conservation Sustainability Committee. Before I turn the presentation over to Melissa, please note that today's presentation will be recorded and available at the ALCTS webinar website and on YouTube. The slides will also be emailed to those of you who have registered for the webinar. You are also invited to use the Twitter back channel #ALCTSCE to interact with other participants during the webinar. However, please submit questions for us in the question box on the screen. We will not monitor Twitter during the presentation. So with that, I'll turn the program over to Melissa. There may be a short pause.
Thank you for the introduction, Stephanie, and thank you everyone else for attending this webinar on preserving historic scrapbooks and making new ones that last. The photographs for this presentation were drawn from the ISU Library Historic Scrapbook Project, which we've been working on for about the past 18 months. ISU Special Collections holds over 1,400 scrapbooks, which date from the mid-1800s to the present day, and our collection continues to grow. During the first 12 months of the project, our part-time conservation lab volunteer, Martha Lincoln, inventoried the entire scrapbook collection and performed a condition survey on a 10% sample of the collection. And the purpose of that survey was really to identify common problems with scrapbooks as they age, so we could develop some sort of standard procedures for dealing with them in our lab. We're now in the second phase of that project, working with special collections to prioritize scrapbooks for stabilization, rehousing, and digitization. We're going to pause now and do a quick poll because I am interested in hearing a little more about why you are attending this workshop. So is it because you are professionally responsible for scrapbooks in a cultural institution or perhaps in a private collection? Are you personally interested in preserving scrapbooks, perhaps one that you've inherited from your family? Or are you more interested in making new scrapbooks than in preserving old ones? And I can see the poll numbers moving, so I'll give just a few more seconds, say 5 more seconds for you to get your answers in. Great, thank you. And so it looks like about 64% of you are professionally responsible for scrapbooks, 28% personally interested, and 8% of you are scrapbookers. Okay, thank you. Let's take a moment now to consider what exactly a scrapbook is. I consider a scrapbook to be any book-like structure or binding with pages or sleeves to which other items can be attached. I often get asked if a photo album is a scrapbook, and personally I do consider photo albums to be scrapbooks. They're just simple scrapbooks which contain only one type of item. Our modern concept of a scrapbook tends to be a sort of memory book centered around specific life events or maybe documenting a year in someone's life. But in the days before computers, when we could just cut and paste with the click of a button, scrapbooks served many important functions, both professional and personal. For those of you who use Pinterest, scrapbooks were really the original pinboard. It was one place to collect recipes, sewing patterns, greeting cards, letters, and so on. And scrapbooks were also used for organizing meeting minutes for committees and clubs, or as field notebooks for collecting data or botanical samples, just to give a few examples. So this diversity of purpose for making scrapbooks is a really important point to consider when treating them, because the original intention of the scrapbook creator should always be kept in mind when you're deciding how conservatively or invasively to alter a scrapbook for long-term preservation. Changing that format is really going to change the meaning of the scrapbook. So to get us all on the same page, so to speak, I'd like to define the specific terms that I use in this presentation. A binding is basically the structure, what makes the scrapbook look like a book. And in the image here on the left, you can see an example of a sewn binding. There could also be an adhesive binding, and these would look more like a traditional book or a journal. And in a lot of cases, scrapbooks were made in books or journals that weren't actually intended to be a scrapbook structure originally. The image in the center is a laced binding, and let me just call it my laser pointer here. You can see here and here there are holes that go through the front and back cover, which have a cloth hinge, and the front and back cover are not attached to the pages. They're just set on top and below all the pages of the scrapbook, and then that lace goes through everything and just ties it all together. And then over on the right, the post binding is a very similar type of structure. You have a front cover and a back cover. There's a post here and a post here, and that goes through the covers and the pages and holds everything together. And this is an example of a post binding with metal hinges, but post bindings could also have cloth hinges, like this lace binding. And then finally, there are a lot of scrapbooks you'll see that are made with spiral notebook style bindings and even 3-ring binders, but I assume you know what those look like, so I haven't included an image of those. Supports are the pages or sleeves that items are attached to. So often these are made of paper. You might also have so-called magnetic pages or self-adhesive. Those were really popular in photo albums in the 1970s and 1980s. You could have plastic sleeves. You'll often see those in a 3-ring binder format where you can slip your items inside the plastic sleeve, and then also plastic overlays. And then the attachments are how the items in the scrapbook are held onto the supports. And I think I've seen just about every possible attachment method at this point. Many different types of glues, pressure-sensitive tape, everything from Scotch tape to duct tape, pins, straight pins, safety pins, paper clips, staples, and of course, in modern scrapbooking supplies, photo corners are now very popular as well. And finally, ephemera is the word that I'm going to use to mean anything that has been put into the scrapbook to save it. And paper and photographs are very common items to find in a scrapbook, but there could also be a whole gamut of other materials, including organic materials like locks of hair, pressed flowers, candy, scraps of fabric, as well as inorganic materials like plastics and metals. So I think you probably get the point here that scrapbooks are very complex artifacts with lots of different components that need to be considered during preservation efforts. There are a lot of great resources out there, including ALA webinars, that explain the basics about environmental risks and how to avoid that type of damage. So I'm actually not going to go into that in any detail today. I've just listed some of the common environmental risks here on the left and some basic storage recommendations on the right for your reference. Today, I'm going to focus on inherent vice because it's really inherent vice that is particularly problematic for scrapbook preservation. So at this point, you might be wondering, what is inherent vice and why is it such a problem for scrapbooks? Inherent vice is some aspect of a material's composition that contributes to its deterioration over time. So one example of inherent vice would be wood pulp paper that contains lignin. Lignin is a component of wood pulp that breaks down as it ages and releases acidic compounds. These acidic compounds then attack the cellulose fibers that make up the paper structure, and over time the paper can become brittle and fragile. And you can see in the image on the right here, the red arrow is pointing to where this support page is cracking. So this is wood pulp paper. It's starting to darken around the edges where it's breaking down, and it's becoming brittle right at the point where the paper needs to flex so you can turn the pages of the scrapbook. And it's no longer able to do that. So if you're making a new scrapbook, you might want to think about what the supports in your scrapbook are and make sure that they're a material that's likely to stay flexible over time. Another example of inherent vice is polyvinyl chloride, or PVC. It's the material shower curtains are made of. And a lot of scrapbooks and photo albums, particularly older ones, contain PVC materials. PVC releases chlorine gas as it ages, and that causes the plastic to break down. Sometimes it can become sort of gooey, and then it will become brittle and fragile, just the way the paper does. So inherent vice is such a problem for scrapbooks in particular because scrapbooks are composite structures containing many different types of materials. Each of these materials may have its own inherent vice, but those inherent vices may actually also accelerate the deterioration of other nearby components in the scrapbook. So in these images, you can see over on the left, this is a post-binding structure. And these support pages are becoming dark with age, and they're also becoming a little brittle. So that post-binding structure is going to be difficult for these pages because they have to flex in a very particular line along the edge of that binding. Then here you can see there is some pressure-sensitive cellophane tape that is also darkening with age. That adhesive is turning yellow. And what you can't see in this image is that the adhesive is also creeping out from underneath the edges of the tape, and it's attracting dirt and dust. And some of the pages in the scrapbook are also sticking together slightly, where you're getting that adhesive creep out from under the tape. In the image in the middle, whatever glue was used to hold those newspaper clippings in place is sinking through the pages and probably accelerating acid degradation in those areas as well. And then over on the right, you can see up here in the top of this image, that is adhesive residue. This was probably a solvent-based adhesive like rubber cement, which was very popular for scrapbooking. And so the solvent has probably evaporated out of the adhesive over time, and the adhesive is no longer sticky. So this program that was held onto that support has popped off. I use the term mitigating very deliberately here. Unfortunately, you can't permanently fix inherent vice. You can only do what you can to ease its long-term effects. So I'm going to share with you today just a few of the really pretty simple methods that we use in our conservation lab to care for Iowa State's scrapbook collection. Interleaving is one of the first treatments we always consider. And the question that you want to ask yourself when you're determining whether you should use interleaving is, what is attached to facing pages in your scrapbook? Are they items that could cause one another harm by touching? Interleaving creates a physical and sometimes even a chemical barrier that can protect ephemera on facing papers from one another. So phototext paper is an example of an unbuffered paper that we use for interleaving. We use it for photographs and it's unbuffered because most photographs prefer not to be in an alkaline environment. It's a lightweight tissue and it won't stick to the image area of the photographs. We also use a lightweight Permalife paper, which is buffered. And buffered means that the paper was made with an alkaline reserve that can neutralize acids that it comes into contact with. So this is a great material for interleaving between acidic materials like newsprint or pressed botanicals. As that newsprint or pressed flowers or other acidic material breaks down and releases acids, that alkaline reserve in the Permalife paper is going to neutralize it before it leaches out into other parts of the scrapbook. To interleave, you simply want to cut your interleaving material slightly larger than the scrapbook page and insert it between the pages. And you're going to let it overhang slightly, and that's fine. But you should be forewarned that interleaving does add bulk to the size of the scrapbook, so it can strain a sewn or adhesive binding that doesn't have a loosening mechanism. If you interleave a binding that's laced or a post binding, you can actually loosen that up to allow for that extra material. Isolation and encapsulation are similar but slightly different. The point of isolating materials is when they are causing problems for neighboring materials on the same page or on facing pages. And encapsulation is also a great idea for materials which are too fragile to just leave tucked between the pages without additional support. So for example, this newsprint clipping popped off of this page. And it's pretty brittle and fragile, so it was encapsulated in this transparent mylar sleeve, just to give it some extra stability and support. You can use buffered or unbuffered paper envelopes to isolate materials. That's great for something like locks of hair or acidic plant matter. And Mylar or Melanex film is also great for sticky items like postage stamps, stickers, sticky candy or candy wrappers, or if there's some kind of plastic product that might be oozing plasticizers and becoming sticky. So isolating it, encapsulating it, just prevents it from sticking to surrounding pages and materials. Stabilization is a term that can mean a lot of different things, and sometimes we use this term in a general way just to mean we're doing things to this scrapbook to try to preserve it. But here I give two specific examples of those stabilizing procedures we would use. One is to reattach ephemera which has become detached. I'm not sure how clearly you can see the image in the background of this slide, but it is a scrapbook that's essentially a photo album, and the adhesive that was used to adhere the photos to the pages is failing, and a lot of those photographs are falling out. I personally tend to be very conservative about reattaching ephemera, and all of the methods that I list here have their own pros and cons. You should really only attach ephemera if you are 100% certain where that detached item belongs. And that's sometimes harder to determine than you might expect. Wheat starch paste is a stable, reversible adhesive, but it's cooked with water, so it can sometimes introduce too much moisture into a scrapbook, especially if the pages are breaking down and acidic. You could get tide lines. And it could also cause cockling. PVA is a synthetic adhesive that's lower in moisture than wheat starch paste, but it has the disadvantage of not being reversible. And if you were to use wheat starch paste or PVA to reattach ephemera, you really just want to dot it in the corners. Don't brush it all over the entire back of a photo or the entire back of a newspaper clipping. Finally, photo corners are self-adhesive, so they can also fail over time, but they're actually my preferred method for reattaching detached ephemera. And that's because I would rather risk damage to the support page than to the ephemera, and you don't have to adhere photo corners to the ephemera. You just stick them on the support page, and if they fail over time and pop off, you're not really any worse off than you were to begin with. If you're lucky enough to have a scrapbook that is a laced or post binding, you can loosen that binding up just to take some of the strain off of the binding structure if it happens to be overstuffed. Alternatively, you could try removing blank pages to take some of that strain off. Less strain also means there's going to be less rubbing of the ephemera against one another. And when you're creating a new scrapbook, binding style is another thing to consider. How bulky is the ephemera that you want to save? You might want to choose something like a laced or post-binding style that creates more space between the pages rather than a spiral notebook style binding or a sewn binding. Less strain on the structure means that your scrapbook is going to fare better over time. You might want to consider making a copy of the scrapbook in its current condition, especially if you consider if you expect its condition to worsen significantly over time. You want to be very careful about laying scrapbooks on a flatbed scanner or a photocopier like the scanner pictured here on the left, especially if there are items detaching which could fall out of the papers, or if the paper supports are becoming brittle. You can risk a lot of damage and have them crack and pop right out of the binding if you're pressing them down on a flatbed scanner. It's really a better option to take digital photographs using a copy stand like the one pictured on the right here. And if you don't have a copy stand, you can really just use a low-tech method of putting a level on top of your digital camera and holding it above the scrapbook. Any kind of photographic documentation of the scrapbook's original condition is better than nothing. I really can't recommend enclosures enough. They protect from light, from humidity fluctuations. They physically contain ephemera and other materials that might fall off of or out of scrapbooks, and they will protect your scrapbook from a potential disaster like water leaking, a drink getting knocked over, a flood, that type of thing. For most of our scrapbooks in our collection, we use standard sizes of flat-lidded archival boxes to store them. And then when necessary, we add extra support inside the box. And we do that because of the way that we store them on the shelf. It's just easier to fit everything onto the shelf that way. In the image on the left here, you can see that white strip next to that scrapbook is a block of Ephemera, which is a stable, preservationally sound foam that can be cut to size to sort of fill that gap. Another option is up at the top, there's a hollow rectangular tube made of folded E-flute acid-free blue corrugated board. And the purposes of those supports is just to hold that smaller scrapbook and prevent it from banging around inside the box when the box is handled. Another technique that we really like to use, which is great for housing multiple scrapbooks in a single archival box, which we do when there are multiple scrapbooks in the same collection, and it's a great way of saving space, is to put an individual wrapper around each scrapbook and then place them into the larger storage box. So in this image on the right, you see a traditional 4-flap wrapper made of Bristol board. And if you don't know how to make a 4-flap wrapper, you can actually just Google 4-flap wrapper instructions, and a whole bunch of different websites offering great instructions will pop up. Another alternative is to make a paper wrapper from acid-free paper. And in that case, you would just wrap the scrapbook the way you would a gift, folding up the ends. You can tape them down, or if you want to avoid using tape, you can simply wrap a cotton ribbon around the wrapping to secure it in place and then put it into its box. Disbinding I use here to mean removing supports from the binding but leaving all of the ephemera in place on each support. So disbound scrapbooks can be housed flat in a box, the way a bound scrapbook would be, or each support can be folded individually and then housed upright in an archival document box like the one from Gaylord pictured here. Sometimes disbinding will be necessary for scrapbooks that require extensive interleaving. So if you find you're having to interleave between every page of a scrapbook, that's probably going to add so much bulk that it's going to strain the binding too much, and you'll want to just remove the binding. Disassembly means removing ephemera from the supports and rehousing them in some other way. Disassembly is very aggressive. It essentially destroys the original creative intent of the scrapbook. And once you do that, the scrapbook no longer has any significance as an artifact. So use this option very, very conservatively, and always take photographs of the original format of that scrapbook before you disassemble it. So that way you at least have some sort of record. Disassembly can actually cause more damage in a lot of cases than just leaving the scrapbook intact, particularly if the scrapbook contains a lot of newsprint clippings or photographs. The one exception to that rule, I would say, is when original photographs are in a magnetic photo album. In that case, I almost always recommend getting them out of there, because that adhesive in the magnetic photo album has a tendency to migrate up through the photographs and cause a lot of damage. So that would be one case where I would say go for it with disassembly. I'll also just say a word about those aerosol canisters of deacidification spray that you may have seen at craft stores or archival supply stores. I really don't recommend this kind of product for use on scrapbooks. And in part, that's because of the composite nature of scrapbooks. Even if deacidification spray is safe to use on printed paper, you really can't be sure how it's going to affect writing or stamping inks, or a lot of people like to use decorative, sparkly inks or metallic inks in scrapbooks. You also don't know how it might affect the different types of adhesives or other materials, stickers, that sort of thing in a scrapbook. And this, that aerosol spray is the kind of thing that can't be undone once you use it. So I really just think it's best to avoid altogether. So to help you internalize some of these options that I've thrown at you, let's do some interactive problem solving using some of the scrapbooks from Iowa State's collections. I'm going to walk you through what's happening in each of the next 5 photo examples, and then you can choose the treatment option that you think would work best. And when you answer these polls, don't just consider what you think might be the ideal treatment for that scrapbook, but actually think about your own situation and consider the scrapbook from your point of view. What are your resources? What supplies and equipment do you have to work with? So scrapbook number 1 here is a scrapbook commemorating a year in the life of one of the student clubs here at Iowa State. It dates from the 1980s. And as you can see, it is a plastic 3-ring binder with PVC overlays. You can see here that the PVC is rippling as it deteriorates. And then there's also some discoloration down here which is probably from the adhesive as it ages. And because the discoloration is around the edges of the page, that may indicate light damage, so light coming in from the edges and causing that, that adhesive to break down. So what would you do to preserve this scrapbook long term? Would you box the scrapbook in its current condition? Would you disbind and rehouse the pages in an archival document box? Would you disassemble and rehouse the ephemera in folders or sleeves? Would you remove the plastic overlays and interleave with another material like Permalife? Or would you digitize it and then box the original? Okay, a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And here are the results. So it looks like the majority of you would remove the plastic overlays and interleave with Permalife. And then a second favorite was to disassemble and rehouse the ephemera in folders or sleeves. I think those are both great options. I was tempted to remove the plastic overlays, but what we actually chose to do was option number one, the one that only 1% of you chose, just to box the scrapbook in its current condition. And the reasons for that is because this was a pretty low priority item for us. Current members of this club are welcome to come into special collections and look at the scrapbook collection in the reading room, but it doesn't have any sort of broad research appeal, so it wasn't a strong candidate for digitization for us. Digitization takes a lot of time and resources. Sorry about that. And then finally, because of the nature of the ephemera in this scrapbook, it would have been difficult and time-consuming for us to remove it. So if this had been a singular, very significant, unique item, absolutely, we would have gotten those materials out of there, or at least removed the PVC. But as I said, low priority, so we just boxed it. This is a horticulture scrapbook from 1937. It contains plant lists, programs from horticultural expositions, and other printed reference material. As you can see, it is a sewn binding. We saw this earlier in the presentation. And it was actually not originally intended to be a scrapbook. It was intended to be a journal or a ledger, and someone just chose to use it as a scrapbook. So the paper is pretty thin, and you can see that it's cockling pretty badly around the edges, which is probably the result of having large printed sheets of paper glued on to the pages with starch paste, which has a high water content. You can also see there are some fold-outs. Here they are folded up, and here they are opened out. And I don't know if you can see these, but right up here, these are staples, and those staples are starting to corrode, and that corrosion material is offsetting onto the ephemera and onto the facing pages. So what would you do with this scrapbook to preserve it long term? Would you box it in its current condition? Would you remove staples and then box it? Would you disassemble and rehouse the ephemera in folders or sleeves? Or would you digitize and then box the original? I'll give you just a few more seconds to get your vote in. Great. Thank you. Okay. So 58% of you would remove the staples and box it, and that is actually what we decided to do with it as well. We didn't want that corrosion to cause any further damage, so we removed the staples. We could have replaced the staples with little loops of linen thread, which we do sometimes, but in this case, those items of ephemera that had been stapled had also been glued on, so we were able to just remove the staples and leave it as is. This could be a potentially interesting item to digitize, but it is a problematic format for good image capture, and it's not a priority for us right now, but it's something that we could consider in the future for digitization. This scrapbook is one of my favorites. It was made by a student at Iowa State College in 1916, and that is before Iowa State became a university. It's a memory book of his college experience, and you can see very clearly here that it's a laced binding with a cloth cover, cloth hinge. It contains some bulky items like this metal and plastic button in the upper right, and some textiles such as this colored ribbon down here, and then the wool letter in the upper right, which you can probably see has some insect damage. It also contains photographs and newsprint, and there are inscriptions made with black writing ink that are made directly onto the paper supports of the scrapbook. So, what would you do with this scrapbook? Oh, I forgot to mention there's also a pencil in there attached to a dance card, which I think is very sweet. So, would you box the scrapbook in its current condition? Would you loosen the laces, interleave, support the bulky ephemera, and then box it? Would you stabilize, by which I mean doing all those things in item 2, and then digitize, and then box the original? Or would you digitize it and then disassemble those items and store them in a box in some other way? I'll give you just a few more seconds to get your vote in. Great. So it looks like almost half of you chose the same option that we did, and slightly less than that chose the third option, which was all of that stabilization and then digitization. And so at the moment, we just chose to stabilize in those various ways, but this is actually one of our candidates for digitization. We are thinking about it for that, so we may digitize it in the future. We go back to the image here. You can see this pencil. What we did was this got put into a box that was slightly larger than the scrapbook, and so we just moved the pencil off to the side so it's resting in the box, not between the pages any longer. And then for particularly bulky items like this button at the top, we cut a thin sheet of Volara foam and interleaved that page with Volara foam with a little cutout so that that button could pop through. Okay, here is our fourth scrapbook. This is a student theater scrapbook from the 1920s, and it mostly contains a few photographs, but mostly newsprint clippings and programs, which have been glued on in this overlapping collage style. The black support pages are very acidic and fragile. They're a little bit soft, sort of the way construction paper is, and there is quite a bit of detaching ephemera. Especially, you can see here is the cover of one of the programs that's torn off, and a lot of the newsprint clippings are also popping off. And those newsprint clippings are fairly acidic and starting to become brittle. Not quite brittle yet, but quite acidic. So what would you do with this one. There we go. Would you interleave with buffered paper and then box this item flat? Would you disbind, interleave the pages, put it in a wrapper, and then put it in a box? Would you disbind and rehouse the papers in individual folders in an archival document box? Would you disassemble and rehouse the ephemera in plastic sleeves? Or would you reattach the detached ephemera, interleave it, and box it flat? Just a few more seconds. Okay, closing the poll. This is very interesting. This is the most divided that you've been as an audience. It looks like by a hair, the second option was the most popular, but it's really pretty well divided between those first four options. We also chose the second option. We disbound the volume, we interleaved the pages with Permalife, we put it in a wrapper, and we put it in a box to box it flat. We seriously considered disbinding it and rehousing the pages in individual folders in an archival document box, but a document box would sit upright on the shelf, and because of where this item is physically stored in our special collections department, it was much easier to shelve it if we put it in a flat lidded box. I find it interesting that so few people said that they would take the time to reattach the ephemera. And that's because for us, we also thought reattaching the ephemera would take a lot of work. And because of this collage style, in a lot of cases, on a lot of the pages, we couldn't be sure where the original location was of any given piece of ephemera. However, again, if this was a treasured family photo album, if it was very unique, then it might be worth taking the time to try to reattach ephemera. This one also presents a lot of very unique digitization challenges because of that collage style. We have one more example. This is another student theater scrapbook. I'm not sure of the date on this one, but the play is Our Town, so it's got to be at least from the 1940s or maybe the 1950s. This photo album is in pretty good condition. It contains a mix of glossy photographs, newsprint clippings, and printed material. And there are some staples right up here, here, and here. There's staples throughout, but they all appear to be stable. There's no corrosion. And all of the ephemera remains attached to the support pages. In the photo on the right, I don't know if you can see here, but the printing ink from the blue printed material on the facing page has actually offset onto the surface of the image here. So, what would you do with this scrapbook? Would you box it in its current condition? Would you interleave it with Phototex or Permalife buffered paper as appropriate and box it? Would you remove the staples and then interleave it and then box it? Or would you disassemble it and rehouse the ephemera in folders in a box? A few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And here are the results. 59% of you chose the same option we did. We decided to interleave and box. I guess I could have mentioned this is a post binding, so we were able to loosen the binding enough to make extra room for the interleaving and then put that in a box. The decision to remove the staples is not a bad one. We chose not to simply because they didn't seem to be a problem. We have over 1,400 scrapbooks to take care of, so we didn't didn't want to make any extra work for ourselves if we didn't have to. And the staples are not rubbing against any of the photographs or any of the other ephemera. So we kept it simple. Let's see. Okay. Now finally, there are some guidelines that you can follow when you are making new scrapbooks that will help save future conservators some headaches. Modern scrapbooks should be stored with all the same precautions that you would store a historic scrapbook. Protect it from light, temperature, humidity, and so on. And if you choose your materials wisely, then you can prolong the longevity of your modern scrapbook by decreasing its inherent vice. So some guidelines would be to make sure that the binding has room for adding the ephemera. Choose a binding with spacers or stubs between pages if your ephemera is bulky, or choose a binding like a laced binding or a post binding that can be tightened or loosened at will. Make sure that the support pages are a type of quality paper that will age well, like a cotton rag. If you're going to use plastic materials, avoid PVC. The most stable plastics you can choose are polyethylene, polypropylene, or polyester films like a Mylar or Melanex. Always use copies or printed scans of photographs, not the original photograph. And use photo corners whenever possible for attaching ephemera instead of applying adhesive directly to the ephemera. Another option would be to use polyethylene or Mylar sleeves. You can insert your ephemera in there and then attach the sleeve to the support page. Abby pH pens are a great tool if you're uncertain whether decorative paper or a storage box that you really like is acidic or not. It's basically a felt tip pen. You just draw a small dot or a line in an unobtrusive place, and if the ink turns purple, it indicates an alkaline or a neutral pH, and if the ink turns yellow, it indicates an acidic pH. I don't know if you can see the mark up here, but there is a little mark here that turned yellow. So these two papers at the top of this image are very similar in color, but you can see as a result of testing it with the Abby pH pen that one of these papers is neutral or alkaline and would be a good choice for your scrapbook, and the other paper is acidic and would be a poorer choice to use in your scrapbook. And finally, I'd just like to encourage you to pay attention to the terminology on product packaging. Archival is not actually a regulated term, so it's pretty much meaningless on consumer products. It's just a way to boost the price a little bit. Acid-free means only that the product was not acidic at the time that it left the manufacturer. However, acid-free papers can contain lignin, which you now know can break down and become acidic over time. So you not only want to look for acid-free paper, you also want to look for lignin-free paper whenever you're making paper choices. That's it. Thank you so much to everyone who has helped with this presentation in any way, large or small, and I would be more than happy to take any questions that you might have.
Okay, so if you all, I know a bunch of you have already put in questions, but if anyone hasn't put in a question yet that they'd like to ask, you can just enter it into your question box. And while you enter your questions, I'd also like to remind you all that you'll be emailed the slides and a link to a recording of the presentation. And they'll also be available on the ALCTS website and on YouTube, so you'll find that information there if there's parts you want to see again. So for questions, let's see here. Melissa Rosemary asks about albums with rings of baby's hair. How would you store or preserve those?
Okay, well, with locks of hair, I guess it depends how it's attached to the page. You don't want to damage it by removing it if it's really stuck there, but I find in a lot of cases they're just tucked into scrapbooks or albums. You can put that in a little paper envelope or even encapsulate it in Mylar if you want it to be transparent so that you can see the lock of hair without opening up the envelope. But that would be plenty. You just want to keep it contained, basically.
Okay. Sort of, since you mentioned the Mylar, there are a couple questions about how you can make your own polyethylene or Mylar sleeves sized to fit the item.
Sure. Polyethylene sleeves do come in sort of a range of sizes intended for photographs, but if you have an item that you need a particular size for, you can buy individual Mylar sheets or Mylar folders that have a fold on one side. You can get those from a variety of archival suppliers. And you can also use double-sided tape to seal the other edges of the Mylar folder. So you just cut it with a pair of scissors or a scalpel and a ruler to whatever size you want. And then I would use the thinnest type of double-sided tape that you can find, because you don't want to put it too close to the outer edge of the Mylar because you don't want to risk that tape adhesive creeping out onto the page of your scrapbook, and you also don't want to risk the adhesive creeping in and touching whatever the item is that you sealed in the Mylar. So just sort of leave plenty of border around the item that you're encapsulating before you put down the tape to seal it up.
Okay, Amy asks, if your whole scrapbook is filled with newsprint, would you advise interleaving every page?
Yes. That's an easy answer.
Yeah.
If there is any way to loosen the binding, then go for it. And honestly, with newsprint, you know, as it ages, it's just going to be releasing more and more acid. So I would even say that would be an example where if you can't loosen your binding, just go ahead and take the binding apart and then interleave every page with something buffered, like a buffered Permalife.
Okay, this is kind of an interesting question. Sue asks, is there a limit to how many individually wrapped scrapbooks should be put together, sort of in terms of weight on the bottom book, assuming you're not standing them up?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah. I guess I would say that it depends what's in the scrapbook. You know, if it is mostly paper items that can't really be harmed much from pressure, I can't imagine that you're going to be able to fit so many super heavy scrapbooks in a box that you're going to damage the one on the bottom that just contains paper. But you might want to think about, you know, is there anything in there that's fragile? Is there something made of Bakelite? Is there something made of brittle plastic? Is there candy or something like that that could get crushed when you're piling extra weight on top? And maybe choose to put that scrapbook that contains fragile items on the top in the box. Honestly, our scrapbooks are so large that I don't think we've ever fit more than 3 into a box at a time, and that hasn't been much of a problem.
Okay. One person, Janine asks, is the deacidification spray all right to use on newspaper clippings exclusively?
Yes. I will say a tentative yes. We do deacidify here at Iowa State. We don't use the aerosol cans. We use a larger spray unit that runs off of a compressor. And really the best thing you can do is make a photocopy on stable preservation quality paper. That newsprint is going to break down, even if you spray deacidification spray on it. But you could delay the inevitable by using deacidification spray. Just don't expect it to be a silver bullet. All it's going to do is prolong the inevitable.
Okay. Marjorie asks, is there any material that can be put on staples or other metal to keep them from corroding?
There is, but that substance is itself not something that you would want to have touching paper or plastic. You know, any of the Rust-Oleum products, for example, that prevent corrosion contain all kinds of organic solvents and things that you really don't want to introduce into a situation like this. So the best advice I can give with staples is if you see no sign of corrosion now, the best thing you can do is keep them in a stable environment that's not too humid. And that, you know, if they haven't corroded by now, then keeping them in a stable environment should keep them stable fairly long term. If you do see any signs of corrosion already, and you can remove them if at all possible, then I do recommend that.
Okay, Mary asks, are you familiar with a paste with the brand Yes? And is this archive safe?
I am not actually.
I haven't heard of it.
Yeah. It's a very positive sounding name.
It is.
But no, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that. We use Zen Shofu wheat starch paste in our lab, and we use Jade 403 PVA. We also use an adhesive called Lasco, which is also a low moisture synthetic adhesive.
Okay, it's Damien asks, I have several pages of a photo album that have already been disbound but are on magnetic pages. I would like to disassemble and have already scanned the pages. How do I go about gently removing the photos? Hair dryer to loosen the adhesive?
Oh, I don't like to recommend that anyone uses a hair dryer unless I've seen an item in person. I'm sorry, I know that's sort of hedging on an answer, but it really depends on what is adhered to the magnetic page, because the heat from the blower could really cause damage. And the other problem is if that adhesive on the magnetic page has already started to age and cross-link, then introducing more heat is actually going to make it harder to remove rather than easier. I recommend that you try going at it mechanically with the understanding that you could damage the items on there. We use very thin micro spatulas to pry items off of magnetic pages. And I've also heard some people have had luck with photographs using waxed dental floss. You sort of work it behind one corner and then gently sort of seesaw it back and forth and work your way across. That would not work with something like newsprint stuck to a magnetic page.
Mary asks, could you describe the interleaving foam you used a little more, such as the name and where to order it?
Absolutely. The name is Volara, V-O-L-A-R-A. I actually don't remember where we order it from, but I'm pretty sure if you put it in Google along with the word conservation, you'll come up with some suppliers. That is a thin, soft foam, and that's what we use in between pages when we have bulky items. And then Ephemera was the type of foam that we use to support a scrapbook that's in a large box. I'd like to note, Eva just shared with me that conservator Susie Morgan from Arizona State, who happens to be a former classmate of mine, so I really trust her opinion, says she would say no to Yes paste. She is familiar with this item. So,
thanks, Susie. That was helpful. Let's see, next question. Michael asks, when building scrapbooks, is it better to not have items facing each other on pages, so only attaching items to the front of pages?
I personally would. I don't make scrapbooks very often, but when I do, That's how I do it, and I think of it as just sort of building in the interleaving.
Okay. Lee asks, how do you suggest keeping items that have fallen off pages if you don't know where it would be reattached?
When we have had items that have fallen off, if we find them between pages, we just sort of go on the assumption that that's where they fell off from, and we leave it sandwiched between those pages. But if we find them, completely separate from the item, then usually what we do is we put them in a folder or a paper envelope, or we encapsulate them in Mylar, and we just rest them on top of the scrapbook inside the box. With a little label saying that we're not quite sure where this belongs.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let me see here. This is probably a good one for current scrapbookers. Why should adhesive dots be avoided? Asks Mary.
Adhesive dots are basically very similar to the adhesive used on magnetic scrapbook pages or magnetic photo album pages. It tends to be a type of adhesive that migrates very easily into whatever it is that you've stuck down on it. And so it can cause little dot-shaped stains coming up through your image or through your printed matter.
Mm. Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for right now. Melissa and or others will try to answer some of your questions. There were a lot, and we only got to a few. But also, in my conclusion, I'll tell you another resource as well that you can go to ask some preservation questions. So thank you very much, Melissa. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
You've given some really great practical advice on both preserving scrapbooks and older collections, but also building new ones that'll help last. So for more information about preservation, please visit the American Library Association's Preservation Week website, where you can find more great tips and resources to help you preserve your family treasures. And if you have additional questions about preserving scrapbooks or other materials that we weren't able to cover today, you can ask Preservation Specialist Don Yukon your questions through the Preservation Week website as well. Thank you again to today's sponsor, Gaylord, and last but not least, thanks to Ava Sorrell for her technical assistance. Please consider joining us for these ALCTS webinars in May. More information about these and other upcoming webinars, web courses, and e-forums can be found on the ALCTS webinar website. We hope you found today's session helpful. You'll soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to fill it out and return it to us. Your comments help us to evaluate and plan future Preservation Week webinars. If you're interested in viewing parts of the presentation again or sharing it with others, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. The presentation will also be archived and freely available at the ALCTS webinar website and the ALCTS Continuing Education channel on YouTube. Thank you all again for joining us today. Goodbye.